we're going to be discussing is conditions that fall within the umbrella of neurodiversity. And I'm going to do an overview of some elements of ADHD and the autistic spectrum disorder as some of the key diagnoses will fall within that group. And I'm going to use the PowerPoint slides that I think were shared with earlier in the week or last week. So in terms of the concept of neurodiversity, I'm not sure if any or all of you are familiar with it, but essentially it's a term that has been growing in strength and popularity as a useful way of understanding and framing conditions that reflect neurodevelopmental differences across the early stage of childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. And the coinage of the term originally came from a sociologist, Judy Singer, and her thinking was that a lot of the differences and difficulties that present challenges in people who are in some way neuroatypical reflect societal barriers and societal challenges, as opposed to necessarily reflecting an innate area of personal challenge. So this led to a movement that has sought to reframe the thinking around these conditions and focus much more on a strengths-based model and an understanding of difference rather than disorder. And so often within this sort of frame of thinking, people can conceptualize neurodiversity as akin to biodiversity, that across all aspects of, I suppose, biology, there will be diversity within it, and the neurological profile of development is no different than any other component of neurodiversity, or of diversity, should I say, and that in being diverse or different in some way, it doesn't necessarily imply pathology. So that's the essence of the thinking behind it. So the types of conditions that fall within that neurodevelopmental umbrella include things like spectrum disorder, developmental coordination disorder, dyspraxia, developmental language disorders, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and broadly cover a lot of the different developmental differences that you can see across the early lifespan, and that obviously play out then in different ways in adulthood. So the reason for focusing on ADHD first really is the fact that it's the most prevalent of the conditions with which we deal in child and adolescent mental health service. So the audit data would show that approximately 50% of children attending CAM services have a diagnosis of ADHD. So it's the commonest individual diagnosis of children attending services. And the key components of it are the developmentally inappropriate levels of activity, impulsivity, and inattention. It does persist across the lifespan. The outcome data is variable on that. So the estimates are around probably 60% remit in adulthood, 40% remit and 60% persist in adulthood. And there are different prognostic indicators that determine the likelihood of ongoing deficit. There's a lot of myths in relation to ADHD. One of the most common being that, it's a disorder that's made up or that just reflects some aspect of modern society or living that's not compatible with typical childhood development. But the scientific data that exists argues against that position, in that the prevalence data from across the globe is fairly much similar, whether you come from a so-called, first world society or a society that's at a different point of development. In terms of the diagnosis, then there's about a 3 to 4 to 1 ratio male to female, but across the neurodevelopmental or neurodiversity spectrum, there's increasing debate about what this represents and whether the prevalence data that we've taken as for granted really in a lot of these conditions over the years is really accurate. And there's a sense that there's been massive underdiagnosis of females, both with conditions like autistic spectrum disorder. The criteria then are that there are 6 symptoms related to the inattention as listed there. So not giving close details or careless error rate, difficulty sustaining attention, not seeming to listen when spoken through too directly, not finishing through instruction, difficulty organising tasks, avoiding tasks requiring sustained mental effort, losing things, being forgetful and being distractible. So they're the inattentive symptoms. And then the 6 symptoms relating to hyperactivity and impulsivity. And it's important to appreciate
the number of penguins that
the different symptoms we're going to present.
Penguin with Ben. Ben
motor.
White opened his present.
So I might ask that
and inside was a penguin. And White opened his.
Oh, thank you. So the way in which the symptoms and characteristics will be presenting will be very different. Development and will vary according to personality, temperament, IQ. For the diagnosis to be robust, the determination is that the symptoms must be evident in some way before the age of 12, and they cannot be. There's 3 subtypes, and the commonest one is the combined type of ADHD. The rate of diagnosis in Ireland is about 20%. So we know the prevalence is 5%, but from the GUI data, I think I referred to this previously, only 20% of children with the condition end up getting diagnosed, and probably significantly less than that are treated. You'll find a much broader variation in children with the subtypes like the inattentive subtype, because the rule of thumb for us working in this area is that children that are causing problems for other people, so typically the children with the impulse control deficits or the hyperactivity deficits will cause problems in different settings that lead to quicker detection and pickup, where the inattentive little child, or the child with more internalizing symptoms, tends to be overlooked and doesn't get the supports that are I put in little videos there. You might have seen that on the sheets I sent around. They're just looking at different. This is an important slide because it lists the various conditions that I referred to earlier there in terms of neurodiversity. And it's very, very important that this is understood, that the vast majority of children that present to clinical services are going to have more than one diagnosis. And this is an issue that comes up again and again and again, where there's a lack of understanding of the diagnostic comorbidity, and a child gets given one diagnosis as an explanation for everything, and that's more than frequently not the case. So in the general population out there of cases that don't make their way to clinical practice, it's likely that there is a higher rate of there just being one condition, be it the ADHD or the dyslexia or the autism or whatever. In terms of the kids that end up coming to clinical practice, there's a much higher likelihood that there's at least one other co-occurring condition. And that underpins a lot of the approaches then that are taken to case management, because clearly if you have additional difficulties, you need additional inputs, accommodations, supports and treatments around whatever those additional difficulties are. In terms of the associated problems, they're there as listed. So up to 75% can have differences in terms of their language profile and learning differences, so dyslexia or dyscalculia, or differences in subcomponents of the IQ, such as your processing speed or your working memory. And oftentimes these things aren't clear when a child is in the classroom or a child is being interviewed. Somebody could come across as very bright, very expressive, very able, and yet when their IQ is profiled, you can see that they can have specific areas of of deficit. The commonest deficit you see in ADHD is a low processing speed or a low working memory, reduced scoring in those areas. But there is no IQ test that diagnoses ADHD, and there's no IQ result that is either rules in or rules out an ADHD diagnosis. So it is very, very much a clinical diagnosis. The reason it's so important that these sort of figures are understood and these comorbidities are looked for is that when they're missed, a lot of the child's underlying difficulties can be misunderstood. So in the general population of development, what you typically see is that the outcome and performance and functional data is fairly predictable about a mean. So what I mean by that is that if you look at a typical IQ profile of a child in any banding, so below average, average, above average, typically predictable results about a mean. So they could be more numeric than literate or more visual than oral or whatever, but there's a predictable range within which they will score. What you see with, in children who fall within the neurodiversity umbrella is that you see much more spiking on the IQ profile and much more scatter. And within that context then, frequently it makes no sense to compute the IQ score together. So to give a very simplistic example, say if you just score, say you scored 130 on one aspect of your IQ scoring, which is a superior intelligence, and you scored a 70 on another component, which is borderline for mild general learning disability. Clearly, you would understand that it's a nonsense to add those two scores together and average them and say, oh, you have an average IQ, you have 100 of an IQ score. So how that plays out then for the child is that you can have area of apparent ability and areas where there is considerable deficiency relative to the ability, and it can mask underlying issues. Also, if you have significant weakness, obviously if you have significant weakness in your processing speed or your working memory, that's really going to hold you back in terms of academic performance. Apart from the aspects like the language and the IQ, the other thing to bear in mind about ADHD is that often there's this very, very simplistic understanding of what it is. And I often say that it's unfortunate, the name ADHD, because people think they know what it is just by the fact that the name is so simplistic, that there's these set of symptoms relating to your attention and your activity level. But what's really, really important to understand about the symptoms is that they occur in an individual context. So they occur in the context of your individual temperament, your IQ, and your personality type. And therefore, the idea that you meet two people with ADHD and you expect them to be the same is a nonsense. But yet it's a very, very prevalent assumption. So it'd be very, very common for me to meet different professionals where they say, well, I have a child with ADHD and they're not like that, therefore it couldn't be ADHD. But that represents a very significant misunderstanding of the condition. The other thing to appreciate about ADHD is the fact that by virtue of having the condition, it influences your psychological development. So, you know, there's this idea of say, gene-environment interplay that's talked about a lot, and the developments on from earlier ideas like nature, nurture, is a child born like so in such a way, or is it the way that they're brought up? And nowadays there would obviously be much more of a subtle understanding that it's a confluence of the two factors, that nature is going to influence nurture and vice versa. A way of sort of understanding that is the fact that your brain biology is going to influence your environment, your environmental responses, and your environment is going to shape your brain biology. If you think of the plasticity of the brain in the early stages of development. So just going for stereotypes, little examples, if I have a little child who's naturally compliant, naturally attentive, naturally engaging, the likelihood is the way that this little child is going to shape their environment is to encourage and draw to themselves more engagement, more interaction, more opportunity to sit, to listen and engage in different ways. And so those brain areas are going to become more developed. In contrast, if I have a little child where their brain biology reflective of their genetic makeup is that they're much more inclined to be wound up, to ignore people talking to them, to not respond in a smiling manner, to not sit down. Often the way the environment responds, i.e. the caregivers, is to engage less because they don't get the same responsivity, to assume that the better thing to do is to not make the child sit down because they don't seem to like it, and therefore the child gains no competency at that, and sure, they hate colouring, so let's not give them a pen. And then by the time they're going to school, they've none of the school readiness skills. So you can see how the brain biology has shaped the environment, which has in turn shaped the brain development, and ultimately leads to a different play out of the symptoms. The other thing that's important to understand in terms of the experience of ADHD is that the life experience of someone with ADHD can be very, very negative. So from a very early stage in development, what this research would show and outcome data would show is that the children can be exposed to much, much more by way of harsh and negative feedback. So a constant messaging from the environment from early days, giving out, I told you to stop that, you weren't supposed to do this, I didn't ask you to do this, I told you to do the other, that's a constant refrain in the child's life. And the deficits then that make up the ADHD condition, while they can seem very bland when they're written in a list, if you go back and think about, well, how do these symptoms actually impact in terms of if a child is being asked to follow instruction and they're told, come on, put your shoes on. Put your shoes on. I told you to put your shoes on. And every single component of the morning takes a similar, I suppose, whatever you would say, plays out in a similar way to that. You were supposed to pack your bag. So all of the disorganization elements, the child that's getting dressed and becomes. And so the family is all in a flap by the time the morning routine is finished and the child is going to school in a highly stressed state. So the symptoms appear very, very, if you like, simplistic, but in terms of how the attention deficits, the inability to listen, to follow through in instruction, to start and complete a basic task, that has profound impacts in terms of the acquiring of independent living skills, the acquiring of a level of independence expected for development stage, which in turn hits self-esteem. And there's multiple ways in which self-esteem is hit. If a child does not have the capabilities that are expected relative to peers, and the child appraises themselves in that way, if the child is constantly being given negative feedback in different environments, that impacts self-esteem. Oftentimes, the child will have a sense of inherent pressure so that they're constantly on the back foot. So going into class and knowing that they're going to get something wrong, or they're not prepared, or they're disorganized, or the teacher's going to be calling them out on things. So what you see then in over the course of the lifespan is that children with this profile have much higher rates of things like anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and other trajectories then like substance misuse. And the understanding of how the child gets into that trajectory fundamentally is that the ADHD symptoms have played out in such a way that it has impacted their psychological development and their capacity to function in a way that is consistent with, I suppose, a optimal well-being. So I hope that makes sense. And you can see there across the board that it's not just the family relationships. A lot of kids would run into difficulty in their extracurriculars, so they're not listening to the coach, they're doing what they're not supposed to do. And then the social skills deficits in ADHD. So if you have an impulse control deficit, you're the child that goes and whacks another kid without even thinking about it, or you're the child that jumps in on top of a game and upends it when everybody else is playing happily. And what you see with the symptoms is that they play out very differently at different developmental stages. So if you have an impulsive little kid when they're in preschool, maybe they're grabbing something, maybe they're thumping, maybe they're biting at another little child. By the time then somebody is in secondary school, the way in which impulse deficits are going to present themselves, most often they're much more risky. By the time you're in your teenage years, if you've got deficits in your impulse control, the range of problems you can get yourself into is much higher. Not least to say that if you lash out and hit somebody when you're 15, the reaction will be very, very different than when you're 5. So oftentimes people ask, does ADHD get worse with age? The ADHD doesn't get worse in the main, but what changes is the expectation of the environment, how people expect a child or a young person to be able to manage themselves. And it would be very frequent for children with ADHD to come in for assessment, where for years people have said, no, there's nothing there, he's just a little boy, or loads of little kids are like that, or there's no difference there to anybody else. And then suddenly the child reaches an age where people say, well, actually, no, that's not the same as everybody else. That is a problem. And when you look back, there's very, very clear markers through the history that this child had these deficits, but the assumption was that they were normative within the developmental range. In terms of the impact on self-esteem, I just use this slide to emphasize the profound impact of ADHD on psychological development. And this is from a study that we did a number of years ago on adults with undiagnosed ADHD. So we found that a third of attendees at adult mental health services had undiagnosed ADHD. And one person gave us this excellent quote in our qualitative assessment, or in our focus group, that negativity was the soundtrack to his life. Constant impact of having people call him out on what he wasn't good at, what he was doing wrong all day, every over the course of his life, and how that impacts the person you grow into being in adulthood. Looking then at etiology in ADHD, it's a highly genetic condition, as are all of the neurodevelopmental conditions. And this is been shown in lots of different ways. The studies have demonstrated that's a condition of multiple genes of small effect. High heritability, and you can see there the NZDZ difference of about 80% to 40%, and sibling recurrence of 25%, and parents about 25 to 33%. And if you think of how these things used to be framed, I referenced this in some of my earlier talks with you, there used to be this very, very blaming, pathologizing, particularly towards mothers' approach in child mental health. And the assumption was that where there was more than one child, well, even when there was just one child, but it was God help you if you had 2 children who had this presentation, because this was a cast iron guarantee then that it simply reflected poor parenting. But as the science has evolved, what has clearly been shown is that that's not the case, that what it reflects is the higher genetic predisposition to the broadly then to run through, and I won't go through this in any detail. As with most psychiatric conditions, the neurobiology is examined in 4 ways. So you're looking at brain structure, brain functioning, the connectivity between the brain areas, and the neurochemistry. So they're the 4 broad swathes that you're going to look for difference, and that's what's seen. So you can see the differences in terms of brain size in different areas and the delay in maturation of the prefrontal cortex, which is the key area for executive functioning. So your planning, organisation, that sort of skill set, around a 2 to 3 year time lag. At a functional level, a lot of kids would have a functional maturation delay of up to 5 years. And often parents find it helpful if that is explained to them, that when they're dealing with a 10-year-old, they're really dealing with a 5-year-old. And sometimes when parents can help you to be pivoted to that position, it can help them to understand the need to really, really drop their expectation of their child and react in a different way. And that can frequently you can see there the meta-analysis, and there's been multiple different studies in this area looking at the difference in terms of the activation and inhibitory pathways in the brain. The main neurotransmitters then are dopamine and noradrenaline, and the focus of the medication is on the noradrenaline and dopamine and in enhancing I suppose the receptor pickup, and broadly speaking, the medicines all work just on different aspects of the receptors to enhance the flow through of the dopamine and noradrenaline. This slide here is really just to draw your attention again to the idea that I've, I suppose, highlighted on a couple of occasions about what is the value of diagnosis and why do we diagnose and why do we see it as so important. And we don't have time to break into groups to discuss this tonight, but in our mode of practice, what we would say is that the role of diagnosis is ultimately inform treatment, to enhance understanding, and to act as a currency in terms of supports and accommodations that can be made available. So they're the fundamental three things that you're aiming to achieve with diagnosis, because obviously if you don't have an accurate diagnosis, you're not going to have an accurate treatment plan. And without the parent understanding what it is that's happening for the child, your capacity to support the child to support the parent to a position of being able to support their child is very, very much reduced. So there's key aspects in terms of the therapeutic way that we would work, where we would see the diagnosis as fundamental. In terms of the treatment approach, then broadly in ADHD, it breaks down to parenting, school supports, and medication. So obviously the psychoed that I referenced, I think the last day, is fundamental to that, helping the child be seen as distinct from their problem. So helping the parent externalize and understand that ADHD isn't something that the child has chosen to have, that these symptoms reflect differences in brain functioning, and that the child requires increased supports and inputs in order to optimize their outcomes. It's very important that parents understand in the treatment that parenting is not causal in terms of the symptom profile. So again, these are old-fashioned ideas that the parenting approach was what caused the problem. And very, very, very frequently what happens is parents wonder if a parent is told to do a parenting course, they hear that as, you're saying there's something wrong with my parenting. And again, this comes back to the psychoed. If the parent is helped to understand that that's absolutely not what you're saying, that parenting is not causal in ADHD, but it is recognised that a child with ADHD will induce a different type of parenting, which in turn can add to the manifestations of the problems, and that what the intervention is seeking to do is offset that trajectory and help the parent to develop new skills, because the degree of challenge of parenting a child with ADHD requires an additional toolkit and set of skills. The other thing that's very important for parents to understand around parenting is that in the data that we have about ADHD treatment, what has been shown is that individual therapy does not change the outcomes for children with ADHD. So there is no evidence base for therapy as a treatment for core ADHD. There is an evidence base for therapy in other co-occurring conditions, but not the ADHD itself. And often if parents are just offered parenting and they don't have a good understanding of the evidence base, it can seem to them as if they're just being told, oh, go off and do this, but we're not doing anything for your child. So what has been found with working with children individually with this profile is that, as you know yourself, an awful lot of children do better in a one-to-one. So if you have 3 kids in a family and one of the children has the opportunity for a day at home with their parents on their own, often that child can be a dream to be with, even if they're very challenging in the context of their siblings. In a clinical setting, what you see is lots of children can engage really, really well on a one-to-one. Everything that you want to hear them say about why they need to behave in different ways and what they should do when their teacher says something or their mom says something or how to manage their anger. But what the data shows and what clinical experience shows is the child doesn't take that therapeutic learning and apply it in their day-to-day life. So the skill set is non-generalizable and therefore doesn't impact outcomes for the child and therefore is not a useful input. And generally what happens when those sort of therapeutic inputs are applied is it's a very, very frustrating process for the parent and child because the child is coming into this therapeutic input that fundamentally is making no difference in their day-to-day life. In terms of the parenting inputs then, what has been shown is that is the biggest moderator of outcomes. So all of the data would show that where parents engage in evidence-based parenting programs, they have the most significant input in terms of the oppositional behaviour elements associated with ADHD and have the biggest chance of regulating impulse control and the hyperactive elements of the condition. And you may be familiar with the fact that a lot of children with ADHD have a co-occurring emotional dysregulation. Okay, so where they tend to have disproportionate emotional responses to situations where they go from 0 to 90 very quickly with a low frustration tolerance. So something that's wrong, it's absolutely awful. I scribble my whole page up, tear it out, get really angry, lash out. So you get that disproportionate type of reaction. That's not a symptom of ADHD, but it's a co-occurring feature that links into the symptoms relating to the impulse control, the frustration tolerance, and the experience of the child as being a more frustrating one when tasks are much more challenging. Now, very, very frequently parents will say, I need something to help with my child's regulation. They need to be in therapy for that. But as I've just said, unfortunately, to date, the therapeutic approaches don't work in terms of that type of emotional dysregulation problem. What you often see then in the parent is that the parent is exposed to multiple stressors over the course of the day with the child because the child is constantly pushing the parent, constantly not doing what's they're told, and that the number of friction points over the point of the day is much increased relative to developmental norms. So the parent has a higher level of daily stress. And typically what happens is that at multiple flashpoints, the parent will respond in a very exaggerated, disproportionate fashion. So often the parenting style becomes very inconsistent. So that I think Anna referenced this at her initial talk, that the optimal parenting approach is regarded as authoritative parenting, where you have clear rules, clear discipline, but there's a degree of latitude and flexibility and understanding towards the child. And then there's authoritarian parenting, permissive indulgent, and permissive sort of dismissive. They're the sort of broad swathes of different parenting styles. In ADHD, an awful lot of children induce an inconsistent parenting style in their child. So what happens is that the parent can end up lowering the bar in loads of areas. So it's like the kid is always doing something that's, inverted commas, wrong. So the parent just lets it go. I can't keep calling my child out on everything. And then they can end up coming down like a ton of bricks on something that's a minor thing. And so we have a little child who innately and inherently doesn't understand rules in the normal way. And the modelling that the environment around them is giving is that rules don't really make sense because they're very, very inconsistent. And then when the parent reacts in a very over-the-top or disproportionate manner, often they're presenting as very frustrated and angry. So the mirror that the child is being held up in the child's world is a world of extreme emotions. So they're seeing much more anger in their parents, much more frustration, much more stress. So we have a dysregulated child emotionally from a genetic point of view, and the environment that's mirrored for them is much more extreme in terms of its emotional representations. So that is why parenting is seen as so core, because if the parent can be helped to understand the profound impact of their responses on their child, and they can understand that that's really all we can moderate or mediate in terms of the outcomes, then we can work towards helping the parent focus on ways that they can do that, which then has the downstream effect of changing the child's regulation, so that ultimately the child internalizes a more regulated emotional state. But obviously, you'll appreciate the fact that that's a very long game that you're playing. You're not expecting that this is going to have results that are going to all be immediately apparent to the child. But over time, if a parent is adopting these approaches, the likelihood that they're going to have a teenager that's more regulated, with better impulse control, with more control of their their emotional regulation, is much, much higher than if no input is directed around a parenting approach. So again, when we were talking about psychoed the other week, these are the type of things that are really laboured in the explanation with the parent. So the parent really has a sense of how high the stakes are for their buy-in and the parenting, how fundamental it is to their child's well-being and their outcome. And in so doing, then what you're hoping to do is enhance the likelihood that they will engage and will have that understanding in terms of outcomes. I won't go through this in any detail, but just for you to know, there's a range of inputs that are available through the education system. The Department of Ed changed their approach there a couple of years back. It used to be very diagnostically driven, and then they brought in this new system called a needs-based allocation model of resources. And the reason for that was to remove the need for diagnosis as an access route to resources, which is a very good idea at one level. The flip side of it is it adds to the potential that more children don't get diagnosed because there might seem to be the same need. But as a position point, it makes sense, because again, going back to my earlier point, we could bring 30 people with ADHD into this room, and every single one of them would have a different profile of needs in the class, because they'll have a different IQ, a different temperament, a different set of strengths and weaknesses, and that's what's going to play out in terms of the need for school supports. In terms of the medicine then, and again, I'm just going to very briefly go through this, but there's a range of different medication types. Typically the approach is that you're going to start with the methylphenidate-based medicines and then move on to the lisdexamfetamine. Typically next you go to an atomoxetine and then guanfacine. So that's the typical protocol. In terms of the medicines themselves, they're regarded as being extremely effective. So the effect size is about 1.2, and the overall data would be for kids with ADHD that 80%, so 8 out of 10 children, if all meds are tried, will have a positive response to one of the medications. 50% will respond to methylphenidate, and then remaining 30 will respond to one of the other medication types. So the issue really is the degree to which there's a positive response and the speed at which that response can be achieved. Because for some kids, it's going to require a lot of chopping and changing to get them to the point where the medicine is is effective. And again, this is where the therapeutic relationship is so important, because if the parent understands from the beginning the nature of the medication treatment, the fact that you're in it for the long haul, that there could be side effects, and that everything is going to be very carefully monitored and titrated, and that there will be, that there's a need to be very, very judicious in the whole approach to medication, then typically for the vast majority of children, you're able to get good results. But if that doesn't happen, parents tend to misunderstand, they expect an immediate response, they drop out easily, they experience a side effect and presume that they'll experience that on all the meds. So there's loads and loads of reasons why, if it's not tightly managed, the medicine results would be a lot less positive. Okay, you can read through this about how the medications work. They all work in different ways, but as I was saying, it's fundamental. Side effect profile then, one of the key things is just a cardiac review before starting on meds, and this largely relates to the fact that there were case reports, mainly in North America, of sudden deaths in children on the medication. And when these various cases were examined or assessed, the conclusion was that the children had underlying heart issues that had not been identified. And so the current best advice is that if there's a high-risk cardiac indicator, so a history of, cardiac issues in the child, one explains losses of consciousness, any arrhythmias, obviously, or if there's a family history below 40, then the child needs an ECG and, if necessary, a cardiac opinion. But other than that, an ECG is not required, just needs a general check of blood pressure, pulse, height and weight, and bloods are not required. And then, the common side effects are very manageable around appetite, sleep, and then there can be mood changes. In terms of outcome data, what you see is that the functional impairment associated with ADHD is very significant. So there's worse outcomes, as you can see there. That Biedermann study is regarded as a classic study of outcome data. And so where kids aren't treated, you see across the board that the functional outcomes are much, much reduced. And then there's been a big focus recently on these, a couple of papers have come out on mortality and ADHD, showing a very significant excess mortality related in the main to impulse control deficits, so falls and tragedies of that nature. So that covers the run through ADHD, and what I was going to do now was just look at ASD in a little bit of detail. We don't have time to cover all the conditions. ODD, you may be 75% of children with ADHD, and is often misunderstood as being ADHD, but it's a different condition. And then moving on then to the autistic spectrum disorders. So currently, you may be familiar with the fact that there's been a lot of moves around in the services provided by CAMS. So when I first was in child psychiatry, nearly 20 years ago now, an awful lot of the work in child psychiatry was around the assessment and diagnosis of kids with ASD. And that has shifted over the course of the last 2 decades. And I'm sure you're all familiar now with the various assessment of need processes and different avenues to assessment. The SOPs, the standard operating procedures relating to CAMS, indicate that if a child has ASD, then CAMS isn't the service for them. But if they have ASD and acute mental illness, then CAMS is the service for them. Or if they have a comorbid condition like ADHD, which is of moderate to severe impairment level. So they're the SOPs criteria for access to CAMS. In terms of ASD, you'd be familiar with the fact that you're looking at a triad of impairments. And simply put, these relate to the social domain, language and communication, and then patterns of behaviour. And just to that within the realm of neurodiversity now, what is happening is that an awful lot of much more subtle cases of ASD are being recognised. And an awful lot of people now are self-identifying, self-diagnosing as having autistic spectrum disorder. So you're looking at a cluster of symptoms across those three domains and occurring at a significant level of impairment to warrant the diagnosis. So earlier there's a very significant genetic contribution to ASD, and you can see there if you've one child with ASD, 20 times more likely than the general population to have another child with ASD. But the etiology really over and above the fact that there are these multiple genes, again, of language and communication, and then patterns of behaviour. And just that within the realm of neurodiversity now, what is happening is that an awful lot of much more subtle cases of ASD are being recognised. And an awful lot of people now are self-identifying, self-diagnosing as having autistic spectrum disorder. So you're looking at a cluster of symptoms across those three domains and occurring at a significant level of impairment to warrant the diagnosis. So earlier there's a very significant genetic contribution to ASD, and you can see there if you've one child with ASD, 20 times more likely than the general population to have another child with ASD. But the etiology really over and above the fact that there are these multiple genes, again, of small effect, how that is actually playing out is not understood at the individual level. You'd be familiar with the fact that there's a myriad of discredited theories, the idea of the cold mother, the more recent Wakefield issue in regard to a vaccination, which still, as you know, casts a long shadow in terms of anti-vaxxers and that context. You do often come across, in association with the idea of the vaccine, I would still meet an awful lot of parents who genuinely believe that the vaccine has played a role in the children's development of ASD. But it's always very important that you bear in mind the timing, which you'd be much more familiar with than me probably as GPs, the timing at which the vaccines take place and the different developmental markers that are co-occurring when vaccinations take place. And so often what can happen is the vaccinations are occurring at pivot points in the child's life where the parent is expecting, we'll say, more language or more engagement or more interaction. And that phenomenon we all have of recall bias, where we look at a particular situation and identify that timeline in our head as being, oh, I remember that before and that after, and therefore there's an assumption of causality because that event, and in this case the vaccination, took place in the interim. So it's very, very common still for parents to make that connection. And then the idea of search after meaning, which is a well-recognised psychological concept, that people seek to make sense of what's happened, and they look at the life event details and say it must have been this because there must be a cause. It just couldn't have just happened with causal factor. There is a recognised increase in terms of the numbers of people presenting with ASD. What's still not clear is there an actual increase in prevalence? Is it just there's increased awareness, increased accessibility of diagnosis, or is it a mixture of all of those things? And the current thinking would be the likelihood is it's a mixture of all of the above, that there's some phenomenon happening whereby there are more children being born with ASD, but also there's more awareness and diagnosis. In terms then of the presentation of symptoms, in terms of communication, you'll be familiar with the very sort of basic elements of things, that the speech is delayed or doesn't develop or regresses, that there's stereotype speech patterns, the literal speech, and then the non-verbal aspects of communication, the body language, the facial expressions, the imitative play. So they're often the really barn door type symptoms. But in the subtle children that are going to be presenting more in the formerly known as the high functioning range, you're going to see much more subtle representations of those symptoms, where it may be that there's just a degree of disfluency in the overall speech, that there's a stiltedness to the use of language, that there's a lack of spontaneity of the flow of conversation, that the rigidity and the concreteness of the thinking is playing out more in behavioural elements in the home, where when you drill down at it, what you can see is that the child cannot think in a flexible way, and it must be just so to allow the child to function. So you'll often see that very literal thinking playing itself out in behavioural elements of the child's presentation, because the child is of the view that if such is supposed to be such a way, then it always has to be so, and any deviation from that is highly problematic and results in emotional distress. But from somebody looking on externally to that presentation, it can appear that the problem is an emotional one or an anger one. But when you drill down below it, what you see is it's related to a challenge in the style of thinking that the child has, and the rigidity and lack of flexibility and adaptation. In terms of the non-verbal communication, then, you're looking at the level of facial expression of the child, the spontaneity of the expression, obviously the eye contact, the moderation of the eye contact, the use of the non-verbals in terms of hand gestures, just the simple shrugs and points and proto-declarative pointing. And the use of the two together, so the eye contact with the speech and with the non-verbals. What I would find as an observation in terms of history taking is that you'll often see histories given where it's written, or reports written up where it says, well, there was no indicators of any of these characteristics in early development, therefore the child doesn't meet criteria. But a lot of these characteristics can be very, very subtle in the early stages. And what I would find with parents is that when parents tell me a behaviour is present, where they're very clear, I noticed from when my child was 8 months old, she didn't make eye contact. I noticed that my son was hand flapping at 12 months old. So when they're telling you a characteristic or a symptom is present, there's a high degree of, validity and what's the word, concordance with the diagnosis. Okay, but not necessarily the case. So if I'm taking a history and I'm here, no, there was nothing wrong. No, seemed grand, couldn't see any difference, and no, didn't really notice. Just was, lying in the cot, no problems, nothing came up with the developmental markers, no. And often when you're trying to take the history, or you're asking very specific questions around the early developmental markers, which a lot of parents won't recall, and they just keep them, no, we've no concern. No, actually, no, they were grand. There was nothing until such an age. And oftentimes, actually, there were early markers, but they weren't seen, and that's in no way to judge or make a judgment call on a parent. A lot of people would not notice these things, but what I'm really saying there is the absence of an indicator does not mean it was not there. Whereas if you're told that it was there, you should have a high degree of confidence that it was. But the absence of it does not remove the probability, if you're seeing a child with these characteristics later on, that there were some features of it. And so the absence of it would not preclude a diagnosis if you're seeing enough of those characteristics in other stages of development. And then in terms of the other impairments in social interaction, just one there, for example, the lack of empathy. within the neurodiversity framework of things, there's a lot of research recently on the idea of the concept of double empathy. And the idea that actually what can be happening for the child is there's a lack of understanding from the perspective of the so-called neurotypical person of what the experience of the person that's neuroatypical has. And so it's not a simple lack of empathy on the behalf of the person with ASD, but there's also a lack of empathy on the other side. With every single symptom that's there, or characteristic, however you like to describe it, there can be this really sort of simplistic understanding that, you know, a child with ASD lines up their cars, doesn't show empathy, doesn't like to talk to people or whatever. But it goes without saying, it's the clue really is in the name, that a spectrum exists across every single symptom. And you can have a child with a profound impairment in one area, so we say doesn't make any eye contact ever, and yet is very imaginative in their play, and you know, so on and so on with every symptom. And if you look at the idea of, we say, empathy, it'd be very common that I'd see kids where parents would say, but you know, he's so empathic, you know, he'd cry himself to sleep if he saw a homeless person when we go into town. I've heard that so many times. But yet the same child would go and would say clobber his brother if he didn't get what he wanted. So with empathy, you're always looking at that concept of accurate empathy. The idea that, is it empathy that's meaningful in the day-to-day life of the child? And also the idea of cognitive empathy and affective empathy. So can I demonstrate my empathy to someone emotionally, or do I cognitively understand the upset of the other person but lack of capacity to convey that in an emotional way? So there's loads and loads of different elements to each single symptom that again needs to be drilled down, looked at and understood. What you'll often see in the more subtle presentation of ASD is that a lot of the symptoms can be apparently masked in the early stages. So if you look at the demands of early childhood, where the little kids are just running around together in the yard and the moms are setting up the play dates for them, and there's a sense that they're all just rough and tumble playing about the place. There's not as much demands on the subtleties of social interaction, the subtleties of knowing what's in, what's out, what to say, what not to say. In general, there's less focus on talking rather than a focus on doing. And again, you can see how then at different developmental stages, different areas are going to be tricky for the child and going to potentially present as being more challenging and more obvious in their difference. Rigidity and the need for routine are also very important elements. And again, just going back to my point earlier on the accuracy of diagnosis, it's commonplace to see children, for example, diagnosed with an OCD, where in fact what they have is an ASD. So as you know, with the diagnosis in childhood, what you're looking for is earlier in relation to anxiety in the other talk. The idea, if a child is temperamentally anxious through their whole life, and that's an innate personality characteristic, well then that's not an anxiety disorder. If a child is obsessional through their whole life, well then that's not OCD. And if you apply treatment strategies for OCD for a child that actually has ASD, you're going to go round and round in circles and not remediate the problem. And again, this is why the detail around the diagnosis and assessment is so critical. It's also obviously really, really important to note, though, if you have an innately obsessive nature, as is the case for a lot of people with ASD, then your risk of developing an OCD is higher, because you could develop an acute onset of an obsessionality around something in particular. So, for example, in terms of the kids I would have seen over the course of COVID, I would have had a much higher rate of OCD-related COVID in the ASD cohort of kids than in the general cohort of of kids. Now that's not backed up by data. That in that specific example, that's just a clinical observation. But you can see how it's so important to understand the underlying diagnosis. And that obsessionality, that need for ritual, it can be really, really subtle. And oftentimes it takes parents years to realise the degree of pressure that the child experiences when there's points of transition. So changing to a new teacher, going back to school after the school holidays, having a new childminder, that points that can be pressure points for a neurotypical kid, that the challenges associated are really, really enhanced in the child with a profile like this in multiple different. They're just little videos if anybody's interested in watching them. And then, you'll be clear, I'm sure, around the treatment of ASD, that there isn't a cure, there isn't a treatment of it per se. But what the cornerstone, again, of treatment is psychoed. And this is something that I hear all the time from parents coming in of kids with ASD, where they feel really, 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 really let down by the system, where they report to me, sure, they did nothing for me in whatever service. All they did was told me to do all of these different courses. And again, it comes back to my earlier point that what the data has shown is that if you take a child and put them in speech and language therapy versus if you put the parent in the therapy, the outcome data is, much, much, much better for the parenting intervention versus the child intervention. So if you think of a little child that isn't speaking or isn't engaging in conversation, going in for a block of 1 hour a week with a therapist that they don't even know, who they already have difficulties warming up to people and establishing and adapting to change. By the time that child is engaging, we've maybe got 4 sessions gone. And what can you meaningfully learn in a limited block of sessions versus if a parent is trained in something like the Hannon program around how you engage, how you draw out language, how you encourage social communication. If a parent engages with that, they are a constant therapist to the child. And again, there's loads of data showing how much you can bring on a child's language profile in contexts like that. And equally sadly, how in certain socio-demographic groups, you can see dramatic differences in terms of expressive language, vocabulary, just by virtue of lower exposure to language in the early years when the brain is plastic and language skills are evolving. So that's why the psychoed, again, why you should do the programs is so important for the parent, because if the parent understands that it's not that you're withholding something, you're not saying, we have this great treatment for your child, we're just not giving it. It's that actually consistently the meta-analysis have shown that the outcomes are better where the input is given to the parent rather than the child. So that in a very broad brushstroke takes us through ADHD and ASD, and I'd encourage you to look into the other areas in terms of the associated conditions like the developmental coordination disorders. And if any of you are interested in neurodiversity, we have a series of really good lectures from our conference before Christmas, and particularly good one is Professor Simon Baron-Cohen, who's a world expert in ASD, who gave a brilliant talk on neurodiversity, and that's available on the UCD website. So if anybody has any questions there before I finish up, I'm happy to take them.
What's the difference between ADHD in girls and boys, and does it change as they come into teenagehood?
So one of the main differences would be that there tends to be less overt hyperactivity in girls relative to boys, and that's thought to be the reason that it's significantly underdiagnosed. And a lot of girls will tend to present in teenage years with more emotional difficulties, and often it can present as, we'll say, an apparent emotionally unstable personality profile. And there's loads of different profiles, but where the impulse control deficits are playing out in terms of self-harm and things like that. But the fundamental difference is the difference in the hyperactivity level, and the idea that girls relative to boys are thought to be better socialized at an earlier stage. So often the social skills deficits that you see in boys aren't as apparent in girls, and the symptoms will be marked, or will be masked. So that's really the main difference.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions there?